Jesse Manibusa is telling us here, open our eyes, Lord, open our lips, Lord, open our eyes, Lord. We pray this through Christ. Your Son, our Lord, who lives and reigns forever and ever.
Amen.
I'd like to kind of see if we can pull the threads together again, putting to sort of a mosaic, maybe a mosaic, a cloth straw of some form. The first thread was the sense of the integration between the human and spiritual. And I want to stress that again. It's not something new with John, nor is it something new in spirituality or even in psychology. It's basically an opening line that we find in the Johannine prelude to his gospel. The Word became flesh. God became flesh. God, the great Mana, the great Spirit, became flesh. There are several theologians who teach in Berkeley, who also teach the problem that what theology has done is taken this wonderful humanity and has reduced it to words. Not a bad concept to think about. Nothing wrong with theology. You need to study, reflect on the human condition, which is its primary work. And it uses its sister philosophy as a way to intellectually understand it. But the primary revelation is that the Word became flesh. Not flesh becomes a lot of words. And sometimes in spiritual life or in spiritual direction, I found people, and I'm just as guilty as I think when I first began to do spiritual direction, I found myself talking and speaking and talking and talking. When do you pray? What are you praying for? Who put you to your knees and all this kind of stuff. And then I think the most important thing we need to reflect right now is the centrality of how in my relationship with God and with my neighbor, I truly am living the totality of what God has created me to be, that the Word became flesh. Also, Jesus said there were 2 or 3 gathered. So there's something about the gathering of the fleshy human beings that allow the power of Christ to be present. So John is not something creative. We're talking about dialogue as being essential to our growth in Christ. Christ himself said it. 2 or 3 gather in my name. And yet we have a tradition, don't we, of some Christians who have run off into monastic caves to be by themselves. Nothing wrong with a monastic cave, except it can become like Lazarus' tomb. After a while, the body that's in there begins to decay because it has no connection with life. And we find ourselves in tension. And therefore, there's something smelly about Lazarus' tomb. I think it's also important that we heard him speak to us about the reality of acknowledging that in every human life there are moments of great grace and moments of great tension. There are moments when we are in great sync with God and other times when we are blinded. I keep thinking of that wonderful reality of Paul and Tarsus. At that point, it was just Saul. And this encounter with this, whatever it was, this moment of insight. Why are you persecuting me? Then he's off in a little house, and one of the brothers is seeking to be asked to go down and knock on his door and speak to him. Enlighten him about his humanity and this moment in his journey. I always wondered how I would feel if I would be searching out the man who had power to liquidate me because I was a Christian. Paul was armed with all those necessary documents that would give him power of execution. How would you feel if you were asked to knock on Saul's door and you know that he is the Terminator? Well, the brother did it. We find the shortest RCIA process recorded in Scripture. He's baptized. Interestingly, ends up in Saudi Arabia for 3 years, so the Acts tells us. And we don't know much of what he was doing, except probably in contact with some of the very primitive Christian communities. Praying through, reflecting on, and trying to understand. Here's this man of radical Judaic formation, trained by the best rabbi in all of Jerusalem in those days, trying to figure out what has happened. And then finding himself doing what the others never have thought of doing. This message may begin with us in the house of Israel, but it's a message meant for the whole world. And so he gears himself up in some way as a new evangelizer, someone who brings the power of the gospel to the world. What are your fears? Some of you have been ordained quite a while. What are your fears? Or another way of looking at it, what are the lepers that you run away from because you're not so enthused about embracing them? Anybody want to be a little public about it? What are some of your particular fears? What are some of your particular lepers you're confronting? I don't trust each other that much, yeah. Okay, that's all right.
I think one of my fears is being true to self, being true to the commitments that I've made with my God. If I draw the short straw and I've got to preach 3 times in 6 weeks, somewhere in there I'm going to rely on somebody else's thought. It was something well said, and I might be able to deliver it like an artist, but it's not me. And if you do that enough, then you're not really going to smell sheep.
Commitment to oneself and to one's God. But leaves out another part, commitment to your neighbor. Because that's really the trilogy of the Great Commandment. Love of God, love of neighbor, and love of self. Jim?
I probably should know better, but sometimes I'm afraid I'm doing it wrong.
Good.
Let's see, what's God's version of misogyny? I am fearful of meeting and talking to women who love the church, but hate men running the church. It really gets to be their time.
Did you hear what he just said? No. Basically, he said most of his ministry is with women who really hate the church. And as a man, he has difficulty in trying to be a servant of the church to these women who find themselves in complete hate of the church.
Hate of the men who are running the church.
Like hate of the men who are running the church.
That's what it said.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a distinction there.
Isn't the church having a dialogue right now about where women really, how their gifts really can be expressed in the church?
Depends what you mean by the word dialogue.
I mean, group,
Well, I know.
very group dialogue, but there is dialogue.
There are some channels of open conversation. I don't think they're really dialogue. Dialectic is not happening. It's in certain circumstances it really has taken good form. Other places it's still moving in. But what's fascinating, again, we're pointing to the present Holy Father, is he's insisting on putting a great emphasis, but in fact he's going to call a synod to explore the whole reality of family, and specifically the role of women within the context of family, and then broadening that word, church. Interesting. It's an invitation to a dialogue.
I think there's a fear that if you really knew me, you would probably realize that I'm a fraud.
That's pretty good. It's going right back to Ron's point, authenticity, to oneself, to one's God, and your fear of how authentically am I perceived by my fellows. All of that is part and parcel of what we've seen so far in these little excerpts in the life of John 23rd. He needed to go to a confessor or a priest friend and have a conversation to voice the reality of the fear, not only of death, but things done in the past, when he was in Paris, for example. And he kind of, it was this comedic statement, you know, when I would go to these receptions and these women with low-cut dresses would come in, everyone was looking at me to see what I was looking at. So he became quite aware of people looking at him and custody of the eyes, sort of thing. Part of his fear. The leprosy fear, he had to get through the leprosy of conversing with Jews, conversing with Protestant leaders. As he said, we met with the Archbishop for 400 years of separation, we never talked. But we shook hands and thought, maybe this is a historic beginning. We've had a little crack of conversation. But we already saw from his experience that when he was in Turkey, he would pray with the Anglican chaplain, and they had prayer together, which already conditioned his readiness to meet with the big arch within the Episcopal Church. What I'm suggesting is, in our spiritual life, be sure you always include your human experience. They're not separate, they're integral. Now that's going to be, I think, a mindset. How do you vacuum out that wonderful division that has been ingrained in there since you took classes in theology or became, as a little kid, we go off and pray to Jesus. I still remember that as a kid I was not the most prayerful individual in the class during a Sunday liturgy. I always ended up sitting next to Sister because I would be cutting up too much in the front row. So my spirituality was this Attila the nun hovering over me to make sure I was going to learn how to pray respectfully. And I wanted to be playful. I can recall, as a newly ordained priest, preaching to a group of students in the parish school liturgy on Sunday, and watching the little ones up in front giggling constantly as I'm preaching. So I figured, what the hell am I doing? It's my zipper unzipping. What's causing this giggle?
Right.
And well, we got the answer. So what happened is I went over and met with Sister, and we're talking. She said, well, don't you realize? She said, you have dancing eyebrows. In my nervousness of preaching, my eyebrows would bounce down the kids' dancing eyebrows. Had the kids not smiled, and I realized what that playfulness was all about, I'd still be causing laughter in the congregation. But now I've learned to put weights on my eyebrows.
You wax them, huh?
I wax them. What I'm making is that input is so vital to our growth in the spiritual life. I can recall recently doing a presentation with the confirmation kids at St. Mary's, and afterwards Melissa invited me to join the group. Her first question to the kids was something to the effect, well, what did you think of his talk? As I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, now, what will they say? I wasn't so worried about what they said, but I anticipated they would be a little hesitant or they would be so glorified. I said, no guys, I won't be embarrassed if you say something negative. The way I'm going to learn is that I get some feedback. Well, it was always very positive, until the last little lady informed me how grateful she was that someone from the old church would come and talk to these young kids about the current church. All of a sudden I realized I had stepped out of the circle of youth into the ancient, retired church. Well, it was good to hear, because I needed to recognize that there's a way of presenting that you don't look old even though you are old. How to help that process is so very important. This last little piece we're going to look at is an important question, and that is the question of obedience. It's a tough one. Do you promise me and my successors obedience? Blind obedience? No room for conversation? Even though I'm being encouraged to dialogue, there's no room here to dialogue? Decisions reached over which I have no control? Comments shared and said for which I have no way of bringing another perspective? Obedience. Comes from the Latin word audire, the ability to listen to, the capacity to be sensitive in hearing, in sight, and touch, using all of our senses in terms of the people share the Christian vocation? How are you listening? How are you engaged in? In what fashion do you find this call to obedience realized in your own personal life? Bishop Cummins, I can't say he ever came to me for spiritual direction, but we had a lot of spiritual direction conferences together. And on one occasion he was sharing with me, he said, you know, Ted, there are a number of young priests who will come and say, Bishop, I talked to my spiritual director and I've made 30-day retreat and I've been praying hard and I know I have to do this and you have to approve it. Well, John tended to listen to that very seriously. I took that as a serious invitation. And then his comment to me, he said, you know, Ted, as the more I thought about it, I began to ask the question, you know, I'm not at all challenging the process. You've been praying, you've had spiritual conferences, you've been on retreat, you've been on your knees. What's missing? You haven't brought me into the conversation. As the bishop, the first shepherd, what do I see the needs of my people, and specifically knowing your background and talents, how to use them? Now, you've made up your mind what you think you should be doing, but we haven't had a conversation, and by putting it in front of you, you're asking us to sign a blank check here. Where am I in the conversation? It's really important. How do we engage those who are in authority with ourselves to be in that conversation so that we can have a chance to be in listening, seeing, touching, hearing, the experiences that can help us formulate our next step in relationship to our life as followers of Christ and ministers of the church. So let's just watch this last piece of the video.
His own way. He believes fervently in his past. It seems that the thing he fears most, and there are others who are the same, they are afraid of Christians getting together. They want from the other churches a kind of unconditional surrender to Rome. They insist that they return to Rome. I realize neither you nor I will be here to celebrate the great feast of reconciliation, but someone must begin to clear away the obstacles which stand in the way. We shall not hold in a historical trial. We shall not seek to know who was right and who was wrong. The responsibilities are shared. Fireboys. The world is desperate for peace. Yes, you are right. He does love the church, but in his own way.
let's continue while we're waiting for that to come up. Let's go. When we're ready, we'll flop into it. The segment shows John 23rd in conversation with Octaviani. And in that conversation, he will remind him what it is to be obedient. The coat of arms for Octaviani was Semper Fidelis, almost like the Marines, always faithful. Always the same. Nothing changes. The Pope then takes him on to encourage him to recognize that he's been called in a unique way to be in harmony with the ministry of the church. It's not one man's church. It's God's people. And then the role of the shepherds within that church, we call them the magisterium, the teaching quality of the church. And the teachers need to be a good teacher in sync with your kids. If you're a good teacher, you're always going to have a sense of who your class is in front of you. You have a sense of where they're coming from, what their needs are, and then you adapt your teaching to the students. And if you're lucky, at the end of the year, after you've gone through a series of examinations which make you look like a very poor teacher, because they obviously haven't gotten anything based on the grades you see in front of you. But then what I refer to in my teaching experience is the Pentecost moment. Oh my God, they got it! And all of a sudden I've got scholars passing the New York State Regents in their 90s. When in the earlier tests they were picking 20 and 30. My God, they finally got it. It takes time. Obedience is a gift that requires a moment of time. It doesn't happen overnight. We grow into an awareness of what all those things are, the commitment to oneself. You don't learn that when you're 25. Commitment to my wife, you don't learn that when you're married. I'm not sure even on their 50th anniversary they're still quite concerned as to what they commit themselves to. There's a lot of things that have happened that has strengthened, refined, redefined what this commitment is all about. It's kind of fascinating, one of the things that you found in your reading of the text that dealt with the issue and the question of the opening of the Second Vatican Council. He simply said, the first session was like a slow, solemn introduction to a great work. It was necessary for the brothers gathered together from far